Welcome to the Nausea River podcast. I'm Theo Morgan, and I'm trying to improve the sound situation here, I promise. We're back to my backlog of live shows. I've amassed 6 in the meantime between the Leprous episode and now. It sounds ridiculous, but people who know me aren't very surprised. We're not doing it in order or even all of them right now, so enjoy this foray into non-linear experimental storytelling, or whatever I've convinced myself my podcast is this week. What even is this podcast? Even if it hasn't had time to stray from its roots, I don't work hard enough to make that happen in a month's time. But I think I figured out the answer at one of the shows I'm going to cover, as it turns out. I know I spent a significant chunk of an episode complaining about the Middle East and Cambridge, specifically aspects of the downstairs venue. I'm not here to walk back complaints, as all my bitching comes from the heart, and that's the point, isn't it? Some of the strongest complaints are about what you love, and I love the Middle East and Cambridge. Every single venue they've built into their restaurant/bar, they're perfect even with their flaws. And honestly, I can't think about anything I would complain about with Upstairs or Sonia. I get to hear from my dad all the time about what a dive TT the Bears was, and Sonia sounds like the best way to revive it if it couldn't live forever. So it's fitting that I can have an episode contained inside the Middle East, maybe barring a few excursions. So let's go through the itinerary. On Wednesday, September 25th, I saw Inter Arma with Piran and Sexless Marriage. On Saturday, September 28th, I saw Gatecreeper with Frozen Soul and Worm. And on Friday, October 4th, I saw Amorphous and Dark Tranquility with Fires in the Distance. The first act at Middle East upstairs, the other two downstairs. Yes, I brought earplugs to all this time. It even pays for the upstairs shows, which tend to be a little quieter. Yes, if you want to end the podcast now, they are all some of the best shows of the year. Absolute sonic bliss for an array of metal subgenres. And yes, I do have a unifying thesis. Every headlining band besides Amorphous released stellar albums in 2024. Piran did too, if it makes up for that. If I'm going to review albums, let it be in celebration of tours, shows, and events. Isn't that what a tour often is? A nationwide party? I mean, it's also hard work for the bands. Touring is expensive and sometimes done at a loss, but then again, so is the average wedding party. And I went into credit card debt to be in my brother's wedding. I'd do that one all over again if this one doesn't work out. You don't think as much about those things when you're in the mood to celebrate. My excitement for Inter Arma and Piran was unmatched. 2 new albums, for starters. Inter Arma built a lot of hype by joining Paul Bearer and the Keening for show dates in the southern and western U.S. earlier this summer. It's just a show of good taste, isn't it? And a willingness to be on the weirdest billing that isn't Blood Incantation and Midwife. I'm not mad about seeing Paul Bearer with Resin instead, but god, that date was during one particularly bad week of my life, and the tour with Inter Arma was a tour I deserved for it. You win and you lose. And Piran's new release came out of nowhere. If you knew about it before that, then you remember where you were on September 6th when you first heard the news about Exhaust, though I was at work, nothing too special. They had quietly worked up a lot of goodwill by being one of the bands associated with the dearly departed Menegroth Thousand Caves studio. Well, again, if you knew. This wasn't a large show. Nothing booked at the Middle East upstairs is. With a max capacity of under 200, let's just say I've never seen it come close, though, to be fair, I've also only gone for weekday shows there. It's a more low-key way to spend a work night than being at one of the bigger venues. The shows tend to get out earlier with less fuss over crowds. And of course, there's something special about being in a room with fewer than 100 dweebs, but my kind of dweebs. Dweebs whose ears perk up for Krallis, Oxygen Destroyer, or Inter Arma. Or Ken Mode, really sad to be missing that show. You see people become repeat guests, and best of all, the lines at the merch tables are pretty short. It's the sort of space for bands that have to run their own merch tables between sets instead of having a separate guy for it. You'll talk to the musicians as you pick out a shirt or a cassette and get their personal Venmo for payment. I can send Mick Barr of Krallis a crisp $20 bill at any time now, though I haven't yet. I'm a completionist, so I will talk about the other opener, Sexless Marriage. They had not released an album this year, and I'll be honest, I am not familiar with their recorded material anyways. They're based out of Boston, and a favorite opener for Grayskull Booking, who organized this affair and many other heavy shows in the Middle East. But I feel like the empire of Aaron Gray deserves its own episode one day. You're in for a treat if you see Sexless Marriage, at least, depending on your tastes. Hardcore punk with noise elements. I'm in the zone I never thought I would be in. Their frontman is almost never on stage. He descends into the crowd with his mic, getting physical with audience members, or at least accidentally whipping you with his long hair, which I got a face full of several times, and it was an honor. I linked their Bandcamp in the episode description, but something about Sexless Marriage is missing when I'm not being a little bit violated. So catch them with Ken Mode on October 12th instead. Plus, they'll have more shows in the Boston area than the other bands will. Seeing Piron and Inter Arma together, though, is a once-in-a-lifetime event. A night to don your finest silks, or for me, a good flannel and band shirt combo. It's a bit of an odd pairing. The two bands matched well on stage, but it's chaotic experimental tech death and sludgy death doom side by side. I mean, I'm glad they cooked it up. My lineup would be a lot more boring. As someone without a car, I do a lot of walking, and I don't have any walking playlists, but I do have bands I gravitate towards depending on where I'm walking or what it's for. There's a certain kind of city music for me, from Devin Townsend's sonic onslaught of genre mashups, humor, and productive anger to Thou's sludge metal bitterness and misanthropy. The music for my happiest weekends, somehow. New York City's Piron are city music, both by location and my definition. They're described as a technical death metal band, but confining them to a single genre is a fool's errand, especially on Exhaust. Released with no announcement on September 6th, Exhaust is some of Piron's finest work. Thematically, I sometimes lump them in with, Thou and Primitive Man and I Hate God as misanthropes metal, but Piron are, for one, a lot more dissonant and fast-paced, and two, pointedly anti-capitalist. Sick of the grind, but knowing they're doomed to being crushed by the millstone. But even if you have a distaste for overt politics and music, it's not a transcript of a local DSA meeting or a Maoist struggle session. And even when it gets cerebral, the music is still ear-catchingly chaotic. There's a lot of philosophy, Marxism, and near-poetic passages, but Piron also tap into the in-the-moment anger of living, and on Exhaust more than ever, making it their most accessible album thematically. Exhaust becomes a word with multiple meanings here, 75% about the overworked man venting while running on 3 hours of sleep and gas station coffee, and 25% the noxious rush hour fumes. If you like the disorienting Gore-Guts-inspired sound Piron have perfected, it's most of the album. Though I do think it's refined compared to, what passes for survival. Also a good record. Tracks like Not Going to Mars and Concrete Charlie are good examples of their classic sound, but for me the album went from great to probably one of the year's top picks once The Greatest City on Earth and Out of Gas start. It is as simple as the palpable rage of a dreadful commute or a frustrating walk at sunrise when you can't stand your shitty hostel anymore. In fact, I'd say Out of Gas and some of Luck of the Draw and Stress Fractures give me a warm and fuzzy feeling, though a very weird one. They almost sound like Daughters songs, but without the secondhand embarrassment of listening to Daughters, which I guess wasn't supposed to be their message, but I'll take what I can get. And I wrote that September 8th, then leaving it on the back burner and anticipating their live set even more. Piron made the choice to, mostly, play Exhaust in its entirety for their set. The hype for the album was palpable both in the room and out. For a band that's small enough to follow me on Instagram now, hi there fellas, I had friends excited and they even got a review from Ebony at Metal and Coffee. It's music that's angry and demands to be taken seriously, but the guys from Piron dripped with glee on stage. They're not huge on stage banter, limiting it mostly to We're Piron from New York City, but added in some industrial loops between songs to bridge them together in a new way. It sounded wonderful in that tiny room. Piron revel in the imagery of trash, roaches, and the bloated corpses of roadkill. The painting of a dead pigeon used for Exhaust, with its guts spilling out into a rainbow oil slick, is probably going to go down in infamy among metalheads. It's a good contrast with music that can be chaotic, but also clean and precise. It's clear watching them live that they're no slouches. There's something deliberate about seeing their demeanor live. Everything they do looks loose and second nature, yet sounds precise, like tasteful art you found made out of dumpster finds. Weird metaphor. It doesn't even fit the venue. The Middle East can look like a dive, sure, but it's a clean, well-maintained place with lots of dedicated staff who you quickly start to remember the faces of. That is to say, Joseph Sater stepped away from the venue years ago. It's safe, and I've never been groped in the crowd. And Piron, that's a good fucking band. It was a short set, and sadly no Concrete Charlie for me. I ended up with a set list, a big first for me even after all these shows, just to confirm my fears. It turns out that the tour was an extended release party for both Piron and Inter Arma. You could describe Inter Arma in a single genre as a death doom act, but it misses the point. New Heaven released back in April, and Inter Arma have embarked on tours in the meantime. With dates with Pallbearer behind them and a headlining tour in Europe ahead, the small but respected band from Richmond, Virginia are in full celebration mode for this album. They're consistent to their sound on New Heaven, just a little more sludgy, melodic, and accessible. No shameful selling out, nor stale redundancy. It's certainly how I'd get a new fan into Inter Arma. The sound is dark but lush, mostly growled, but with Mike Paparo's singing voice getting to shine a little more. It's more controlled and mournful than ever, though still able to be dissonant and disconcerting like a lot of death metal's more experimental entries. There's an odd sense of hope on the album. Instinctually, I wanted to compare it to Mind Burns Alive by Pallbearer, released just weeks after New Heaven and sitting side by side as they toured the southern US together. Musically, Pallbearer is on the other side of doom metal. Slow, melodic, mostly clean singing too, and Mind Burns Alive, a beautiful album for the record, is pretty doom and gloom lyrically. It's more positive sounding than Inter Arma's output, even having this airy, major key quality that you rarely hear in doom metal. But the lyrics are always about the inevitable end. They know they're gonna die. New Heaven concerns itself with being the final survivor instead. Gardens in the dark and concrete cliffs for when you survive what your best friend doesn't. The children the bombs overlooked for surviving war and conflict, something all too poignant in 2024. And I think the narrator actually does die at the end of violent seizures, but let's not get into it. I like the idea of survival better. Inevitability is a pretty consistent theme for doom metal. If you argue at the genre started the moment Tony Iommi strummed the tritone for Black Sabbath's eponymous song, then that theme is where the genre started too. You try to outrun an evil that will consume you anyways. But Satan isn't real, or at least is a lot more passive in his approach. Those fears and priorities change, sure, but only as you endure. Seeing friends and family die from the same near-death experiences you tried to brush off, and so you write about it. Inter Arma can at least say it in a poetic verse, but I'm stuck with podcasting. Inter Arma, despite their dark music, performed the entirety of New Heaven in full lighting. It's an expansive, cavernous album from which very little light escapes, but you're packed into the Middle East upstairs, and the stage's capacity maxes out at 5 people, too. The guys of Inter Arma dress in jeans or shorts, and the band tees like the rest of us, even with some color in there. Shout out to the drummer's pink shorts. It's a close and intimate affair for an album that feels so lonely. Did it ruin it? Of course not. The emotions change a lot when it's up close, looking right into Mike Paparo's wild eyes. There's finally a man behind the sorrow and impossible odds of living. If anything, he is still feeling the weight of the lyrics. It's a comfort not being alone with very lonely music. Live, the sound leans more into the heavy dissonance of Inter Arma. Even if you're used to metal, death metal, experimental crap too, dissonance is unnerving on a primal level, your mind failing to process the music in front of it. Of course, for the outsiders listening to this podcast, it's all deliberate and noticeable even when listening to New Heaven on the album. But the album gives you a little more room instead of being crammed against sweaty bodies. Exhaust and New Heaven are some damn fine releases this year. Top 10? Hard to say, it's been a really good year. Also, I can't forget to mention that Inter Arma are a little bit funny. Once the New Heaven setlist wrapped up, they had room for a couple more songs and wishing Piron vocalist Doug Moore a happy birthday. In my head, I'm still calling the other bands Python and Sexy Marriage like they did. It was nice to see the camaraderie, assuring us it wasn't a tour of convenience or anything. It's a great show. Rewinding back a few weeks to before the Amon Ra show, my friend Michael C. had lunch with me and asked if I was going to Gatecreeper with Worm and Frozen Soul on September 28th. I was considering it already, but didn't have the heart to be non-committal that afternoon. At least the tickets were comparatively cheap. It was a weekend that turned out to be freer than I thought, and even better, I got to sleep on a different friend's air mattress overnight. Whoever it was, he's not a metalhead, and his eyes glazed over a bit when I talked about my night. And yes, I still made the decision before Gatecreeper's Post Malone-induced publicity bump. Anyways, it's really cool when a popular musician not only likes metal, but something you have to know about the genre to like. I'm not going to call Gatecreeper an ultra-underground band. They pack the Middle East downstairs and are huge by death metal standards. But if you're not interested in extreme metal at all, then you don't give two shits about Gatecreeper. Apparently this is nothing new for Posty. I'm only bringing it up because I know someone would give me shit if I didn't. Gatecreeper were touring in support of their newest release, Dark Superstition, but Worm and Frozen Soul haven't had any major releases this year. At least Frozen Soul have done a lot of shows in support of 2023's Glacial Domination, including a spot opening for Amon Amarth earlier in May. In case you're wondering, no, they stopped in Connecticut instead of Massachusetts. No direct trains, and give me a fucking break. At least it opened up the door for me to get a concussion at Sanguisugabog that weekend instead. All three bands share this air of dark fantasy to some extent or another. But in the end, Gatecreeper looked like a bunch of gas station attendees, and Frozen Soul looked like your tabletop gaming buddies. Worm embraced it a lot more between its 5 live members, from a simple cloak and corpse paint combo to goth club wear to looking like Dracula from Castlevania. The frontman will brandish a sword or drink fake blood from a chalice between verses. It's a speed run of black metal visual cheese, but I loved it. I love musicians who will mug to you on stage, like lead guitarist Roth Sepentrion. If it helps, his real name is Philippe. I describe Worm as black metal, but they inject a lot more gloom and virtuosity into their music, from dungeon synth interludes to extended guitar solos. They openly embrace the doom metal label too, but in all honesty, I'd recommend them alongside Emperor to a power metal fan who's curious about extreme metal. Some of the guitar work took me back to being a middle schooler who just discovered Sonata Arctica. Live, it's brilliant. There's more life to it than crossing your arms and nodding like at other black metal shows, though it's not like Worm opened up the pit either. Frozen Soul are more in the vein of standard death metal. They want to be cold and fantastical with snow-covered skeleton props, and I even got pelted with fake snow when they started the set. They're proud to be obsessed with the cold, and most likely their Warhammer figurines too, but deep down they're a bunch of Texans ready to make the pit feel sweaty and sticky just like home. I could talk about their music. I'd accuse them of being a second-rate bolt thrower, but we don't have a first-rate bolt thrower anymore, do we? But they brought out a side of Boston that I rarely see nowadays. I was shocked to come back to shows this year after my long hiatus in my pandemic bunker and finding very tame crowds. Circle pits would form, but only after loads of effort. What happened to bullshit like moshing to Electric Wizard in 2019? But Theo, you ask, you said you got a concussion at Sanguisugabog in Boston just this May. But the bog were an exception, not a rule. It shouldn't take Sanguisugabog to make me fear for my life. My mom hates it when I talk about crowds at metal shows. The incident in Sanguisugabog made her extremely worried for my safety, so let me be clear, because she is a listener. I sustained no injuries from Frozen Soul, but maybe I came close. I feel like vocalist Chad Green spent half his time at the mic provoking us to push, to crowd surf, to stage dive, to make the pit a little bigger because they're from Texas and everything's bigger in Texas. He's a big guy himself, so when he speaks, you listen. Getting onto the low stage at the Middle East downstairs is so easy a child could do it. So yes, there is stage diving. It's become a big no-no at a lot of venues now, obstinately at the Middle East too, but I think they are futile to stop Frozen Soul's reign of terror. Maybe I just mentioned it to yap about crowd control. I like the Middle East response to stage diving, probably coming about due to the small spaces they have near the stage. If someone got on stage, they had a dedicated man standing to the side of the stage that would let them dive, but with a controlled telegraph pushed into the crowd. Honestly, it probably made everyone happy. Rowdy kids can still have fun, and the venue's lawyers get to sleep for another night. Frozen Soul were fun, but when they left stage, my friend and I finally reunited. Michael was late. Very late. He missed Worm entirely. I got to tell him all about Worm later and be smug about it. We talked very little about Gatecreeper, but I still had opinions. Hailing from Phoenix, Arizona, Gatecreeper had a lot of buzz and goodwill about them before Dark Superstition's release. They might not be old-school death metal royalty, but they're definitely one of the biggest modern names. One would think they'd have spent their whole career being a shoo-in for my tastes, from being classic death metal to becoming old In Flames worship on Dark Superstition, to the point of opening for In Flames earlier this year, a tasty charcuterie board of Theo Morgan's playlist picks, but I would not be compelled to review Gatecreeper if they released another Deserted. As a straight-up death metal act, Gatecreeper were good, but not great. It's not even a huge knock against them. It's a big genre after all. You can't have a cohesive genre if everyone is bending the definition of it. You need lots and lots of standard bearers. You need that baseline to build off. I checked out Dark Superstition when Gatecreeper's headlining show at the Middle East downstairs for September 28th got announced, and I ignored it for a while. But curiosity got the better of me for the album. Maybe death metal and black death metal are older and younger brothers, but to me, they're almost two different genres. When the hell did Gatecreeper get interesting? Like, maybe not my album of the year, but an absolutely delightful release that breathes new life into the Guttenberg sound of the last millennium. Of the so-called Guttenberg trio of Dark Tranquillity, At the Gates, and In Flames, my pick ultimately goes to early In Flames. They also fell off the hardest into a dark chasm of unimpressive alternative metal and the fast decline of Anders Frieden's voice, but does speak to the strength of their back catalog, a landmark stretch of albums that bridge Swedish death metal with the melodic sensibilities of Iron Maiden, and they haven't come even remotely close in almost 25 years, even more so if you hate Clayman, which I can't bring myself to do. So let anyone volunteer to bring it back. Dark Superstition is 37 minutes of headbangable, catchy, melodic death metal, and I'm really sad when it ends. It keeps some of the Gatecreeper staples, namely the rougher production and the dirtier guitar tone than Guttenberg's finest men. It's an addictive touch to the album that gives it more weight than some of their contemporaries and idols alike. The whole album walks a fine balance. The music has a big epic feel to it without getting corny or clashing with the band's more unkempt image. Every melody is super memorable without feeling too commercial or big label. After all, this is their first release on Nuclear Blast, and sometimes that's the sonic kiss of death. It even happened to their new label mates In Flames, in a way. Fuck! I know the inflamed comparisons are probably a little stale now, but to say one more thing, it's good to have a band like current Gatecreeper in a live setting too. Because who is playing In Flames' greatest hits live? Certainly not In Flames. I would honestly have trouble justifying seeing them live with the set lists they tend to stick to. They can suffer the consequences of not banking on 90s mellow death nostalgia. It's their choice, even a valid one at the end of the day, but I know what I want to spend my night doing. Gatecreeper kept the Circle Pits and Mayhem from Frozen Souls set. Maybe we had all gotten a little tired, or I had gotten better at watching people's moves, but I felt less in danger. That being said, poor Michael elected to stand behind me and got slammed into me quite a few times in the process, but we're still friends despite that. Despite me not participating in the pit or making the crowd heave me up, there's something I enjoy about the physical aspect of a wild metal show. There's something for me even if I'm too short, weak, and gimpy for the action. The push of the crowd from behind me feels like a hug, and I jokingly call my bruises concert hickeys. Fat black and blue marks on my arms if it's the Paradise, and legs if it's the Middle East. Fortunately, most venues are big enough to accommodate all sorts of concert goers. I seek out the sensory experience of shoving and protecting myself from the pit. Others can cling to the sides or further back or go with a protective friend. Gatecreeper played a good mix of songs, though it was heavy on Dark Superstition material. At worst, there is a clear demarcation between old and new stuff. It was a pretty drastic change for them. They themselves admit that on their Nuclear Blast page. Thankfully, I enjoy old Gatecreeper a lot more live than on the album, as one setlist didn't feel too highbrow for the Middle East, and the band members remained fun and irreverent throughout. At the end of the show, frontman Chase Mason whipped out his dinky digital camera to snap some photos of the crowd. Some of his shots from each show wind up on Instagram, and one crowd shot has me peering out the bottom left corner, and Michael leaning over my shoulder and giving the horns. The grainy finish, the unflattering flash, the low resolution smoothing out both of our wrinkles. It really is a throwback to a simpler time in melodic death metal history. Like it's 2007, so In Flames has still sucked for years. Most of all, I spent time with my friends that weekend. Friends who tried to understand my hobby as I tried to understand their tabletop gaming and rock climbing. Normal stuff. I inherited them from my brother. They probably thought his weird older sister would end up as the kind of weird that got deep into video games and manga. But we've all watched each other grow up, and a lot of those details don't really matter. I had my time with my metalhead friend the night before. Michael and I had to take the same train back after all. He's older than me by a fair deal, enough so that he's been going to metal shows since before I was born. Before Gatecreeper went on, he mentioned seeing Morbid Angel in 1993. But on the train, I brought up the Amorphous and Dark Tranquillity double feature for the next week. He considered it, but it would soon be clear that it was a show I was going to alone, without him, a guy who was at ground zero for all the developments in Scandinavian melodic death metal, regardless of if he was a mega fan or not. I hope I make you proud. Dark Tranquillity have always been a proud member of the Guttenberg Trio, a name for the three most popular death metal bands from the Swedish city, At the Gates, In Flames, and Dark Tranquillity. Why the hell do I keep talking about this shit? Acting like any of the three are inessential is just silly, but something about Dark Tranquillity seemed to make them the smallest of the big fish. Maybe fewer people cited them as an influence, or they had less popular clones. While every band has its ups and downs, there's no compelling twist to the timeline of Dark Tranquillity either. They never broke up, unlike At the Gates taking several breaks. They brought in other influences here and there, but never changed genres and disappointed fans as much as In Flames did. The lineup changed a lot, but not with gripping drama either. And perhaps I'm projecting, as I like the other two bands more, at least if we're comparing their output before 2000. That being said, End Time Signal is one of the best releases any of the old men of Gothenburg have produced in 2 decades or more. It is my personal favorite Dark Tranquillity release. It's better than The Gallery. If you're into The Gallery for the noodly neoclassical guitar sweeps, then there's less of that on End Time Signals. It's still full of catchy riffs, but it's cleaned up, refined, mature, fitting for a band that's over 30 years old now without being embarrassing in the slightest. There's always this idea in some darker metal circles, no one being against the Gothenburg style, but thinking of it as something they grew out of. Instead, what a wonderful thing to grow into. Okay, I didn't go to the show for Dark Tranquillity. I'm a longtime fan of Amorphous. I joked a lot about being a tour for 30-somethings who got into Scandinavian melodeath as teens back in the 2000s, but I was a latecomer, discovering it a decade late in my 20s instead. And hey, End Time Signals came up on the release radar for the r/metal subreddit. I tried to arrive as early as possible after work, but the line had grown considerably outside of the Middle East. A sea of largely clean-cut men in their 30s and 40s who blended into their office jobs once they took off the Insomnium and Rotting Christ shirts. I described them in a text as Jeff the software engineer, not an actual comment about their jobs or names, but realizing what all these teenage metalheads from the 2000s grew up into, blaming on job dress codes, nagging wives, male pattern baldness, or, God forbid, personal preference. After all, who am I to separate myself from them? Once I button up my flannel and put some pants on, I transform into the related Jess from IT. I have long hair now, but I'm a woman. I complimented a student at the college I work at on his Devourment tee, and he was surprised I knew about Devourment, probably because I go into work looking like I'm listening to the Indigo Girls and pulling in matches on Her. And let's be clear, I am not pulling in the matches on Her. Shit-ass app. What else could I say about the crowd? There wasn't much time to interact with the crowd that night. The doors opened earlier than expected, and I had to work hard to keep a spot up front as we tested the capacity of the Middle East. It was a hot, sweaty, kind of smelly mess. Every one of us suffering a little to fulfill our teenage Nordic metal dreams 2 decades too late. I couldn't manage to see Amorphous before this, after all. Fires in the Distance opened for the dual headliners. They make European-style melodic death metal while hailing from nearby Connecticut. The Camelot of Melodeath, if you will. Or at least better old-school Melodeath worship than the Black Dahlia murder. Yes, I'm still seeing them live, shut up. I enjoyed Fires in the Distance, but they're notable for being the only band that night with a frontman who played an instrument. He was wonderful, by the way, a good musician with tons of silky blonde hair that I greatly envy, but it does mean that all his energy goes into growling and rhythm guitar. This is perfectly fine and even pretty common. After all, why have an extra guy for only vocals when you don't need him? But there's something special about the dedicated vocalist, a mobile, dynamic, public face for the band in music videos, on stage, and of course in glossy photo spreads. If you can afford them, go nuts. Frontman Mikael Stana is no longer a young man. It's not a complaint, it's praise. It's an honor knowing your band is as old as it is. And this isn't a podcast for nitpicking people's looks. In fact, I thought Stana looked distinguished and well-styled in his leather jacket. His live voice is effortless, both clean singing and growling alike, and he does all that while moving constantly on stage. He is expressive, with an unstoppable grin on his face and a tendency to put one foot up on a speaker and lean close to the audience. Stana acts like he should be sweating buckets, but isn't, so none of it drips onto you. I couldn't say the same for Frozen Soul the week before, for instance. At most, Mikael's hands are a little clammy when he offers you a fist bump. And he does that a lot too, being close to the front. I got 2 in, if I remember correctly. It was a delightful show. They might have been able to cut their keyboardist from it and save on visa fees, but I'm starting to think that's just a problem with the Middle East downstairs. Meanwhile, the guitar work was up front and tasty, more loose and fun than Dark Tranquillity managed to be on record, and both regular guitarist Johan Reinholdt and the live edition of Peter Lisa Hansen are in their element. Reinholdt looks serious on stage, and Hansen is infectious infectiously happy and confident. His mugging to the crowd rivaled Stana's, and it was a wonderful combo. It's the sort of stage energy that makes me feel at ease, less embarrassed at my own excitement. Fast forwarding a little, I did get to say hi to Mikhail Stana at the bar that leads into the Middle East upstairs after the show. I think his onstage demeanor is completely genuine. Dark Tranquillity could have rested on their laurels a while ago or stuck with the European tour circuit. But there they were, having a beer in Cambridge, Massachusetts and signing fan merch. I didn't get anything signed, for the record. The set list was a nice mix of old and new. The only criticism about Dark Tranquillity that sticks is that they don't change their sound much, despite having a lot of lineup changes. Stana is the lone original member left. There's a difference between Skydancer and End Time Signals, but no one's shocked it's the same band either. So when it's all together in a live set, it flows like a waterfall, a cascade of mellow death bliss. 6 guys smug about 30 years of solid releases, including one this year. And that should be the end of the thesis, looking at some of 2024's best combos of new albums and tours, but then again, Amorphous haven't released new music in 2 years. Fine, I'll review the goddamn Amorphous album. No, I didn't like Halo. It was pretty mid. Amorphous' whole thing are catchy, memorable melodies woven in with melodic death metal riffs and funny prog and folk influences, and there was nothing memorable about Halo. It stinks because it's stylistically amorphous. They've done little to betray the sound they made for themselves on Elegy throughout the years, and usually to better returns than this. They didn't make any controversial changes, it just wasn't their best at all. But hey, I wanted to see them live more than anything. They could have released Finland's Saint Anger for all I care. Amorphous are a lot more serious on stage. No smiling, they are Finnish of course. All eyes are on frontman Tommy Utzon. In promotional pics, he at least shows his pretty face, but live his long dark hair is always in his eyes. It's like a veil over him. He's another dedicated vocalist without another instrument, having to handle all the harsh vocals and most of the clean ones too. Utzon is, for the record, the best vocalist Amorphous has had, in that both his styles are anywhere from serviceable to even kind of good. Unlike Dark Tranquillity, Amorphous are a 6-piece band both on and off stage, no additional personnel required besides the roadie who did the mic check and finish. The sound of all 6 thankfully doesn't get lost on stage this time. Even the keyboardist, the common victim at the Middle East downstairs' soundboard, was loud enough in the mix. Otherwise, imagine playing Black Winter Day without that keyboard lead. It's like covers of For Whom the Bell Tolls that keep the bass low in the mix, including some actual performances from Metallica. Extremely wrong either way. They may have disappointed me with Halo, and they included a decent amount of it in their set list, but the material works better live, and they had an acceptable selection of other songs. I sit there waiting for the deep cuts that will never come, I guess, yelling out Drowned Maid several times. They did not play Drowned Maid. I was convinced it was a more popular pick off Tales from the Thousand Lakes than it is. They did the Castaway, and my 2009 heart was tickled by Skyforger being their mid-era darling. We got Silver Bride, we got Sky Is Mine. Their bassist sung the parts that Marco Hietala did on this recorded version, and I missed the real deal, but I understand completely. This isn't to say that I hated the Amorphous show. I loved it. I will cherish this night forever. And what they lack in appeasing the tastes of a weird girl who was essentially held prisoner for formative years, they more than made up for in showmanship. The serious demeanor of the band helped keep Amorphous' music feeling full and epic throughout the whole set. Here's how I know I'm not just being a fangirl. The music of Amorphous isn't pure death metal or even pure metal, but it is probably moshable. I'm sure if this was at the Palladium, someone would open up the pit. But the whole crowd, almost 600 strong, stayed focused on the music. No talking. Responsible phone use for photos and videos, sure. Lots of headbanging, as one expects, but the performance mattered. Hundreds of boring career people, again, myself included, feeling the misunderstood, nerdy, probably bullied inner child finally get a break. If I was 15 again, the show would have changed my life. There wouldn't even be complaints made out of love, just awe and maybe a little crush on Tommy Utzon. But now that I'm 30, I actually have people to talk to about it. Before this, I was going to have a supplementary episode ranking all of Amorphous' albums for fun, but they have a long discography and a lot of stretches of albums where all I can say is, well, it's some damn fine music. And that wasn't all I wanted to say about albums. I had a review for Midwife's No Depression in Heaven that called it boring for 3 paragraphs, but I realized that my views were a lot more complicated about it, and that her music is perfectly crafted for people who are not me. Plus, Madeline Johnston is a sweetheart, and her live set for Blood Incantations this November is one of my most anticipated shows this year. Ultimately, I kind of had to realize that my show best focuses on other topics. I didn't do much of what I call yapping about concerts at the Amorphous show. There was a guy near me who I remembered from Leprous, but I couldn't talk to him without it being awkward to the random couple in between us. But I did a lot of it at Piron and Inter Arma. 4 of us came together because we all went to see Krallis that summer. 3 of us in Boston, it's how we met, and 1 in Providence. And it was one of the best concert conversations I had. Just 4 fans bragging about the 2-hour Krallis set and whatever else we went to that the other 3 missed. Summer Gloom, the Jane's Addiction show where 2 guys fought, all that crap. I finally figured out what I wanted the most from my podcast, a safe space where I don't feel too awkward about the bragging. I'll never be the needle drop, even if I wanted to emulate Anthony Fantano when I started this show, but I'll celebrate good new music at the party thrown for it, at least. I even had a yellow flannel on for the Amorphous show, but yeah, Halo is still not that good of an album. Well, that was a late release. Okay, I feel like I have to put this in here because they follow me on my personal account now. I did try to get an interview with Piron, any of the 4 members really. I whittled it down to a few questions in Instagram DMs, and then this episode became a bit too much of a mess for it. So if I wasted your time, I'm sorry. Doubly so for not getting your cassettes during Bandcamp Friday. I guess to be brief, it sucks that Menegroth Thousand Cave Studio closed, but they'll adapt. Their favorite city on the tour was Philly. They were given a 30-minute slot from the Middle East and had to make cuts. Unfortunately, they were Concrete Charlie and Luck of the Draw, and I'm only a little bit sad. I don't know exactly who answered them, but really, thank you. I'm still very new to this game. If we ever do a recorded interview, I'll think through my answers better and bug you about scarcity and couch slut like a good fan. I promise. I'm someone who gets show FOMO pretty easily, but in doing research, I found the channel for the videographer Dirt the Sixth, and it included all of the shows I covered here. He is, as far as I'm aware, fully sanctioned by the Middle East and the bands included, and records full shows for archival purposes. I'd seen him before with his camera set up, but never thought to search for him either. I mean, I feel fine about the videos being posted because I paid the price of admission too. It's nice to see the memories live on in higher quality than my phone can provide. I linked him in the description too, go see what I'm talking about, and support the bands in other ways if you like them. If you can't see them live, then let your dresser drawers overflow with shitty Gildan t-shirts. I got both, and I wouldn't have it any other way.